micro adjustment on microphone for just a second here. Welcome. We're delighted to have you all here this evening. My name is Penny Wright. I know many of you, some of you I don't know, but welcome to every one of you. I'm not sure how we found out about Jamie MacGuire. Perhaps he introduced himself to us. But we are very
Just like me.
Well, you were a good welcoming committee this evening, I have to say. So, and that may be how we found out about him. But for those of you, and I know he knows some of you, but for those of you who are not familiar with Jamie MacGuire, I will tell you a few things about him. Jamie MacGuire, James P. MacGuire, was born in New York, grew up on Long Island, and was educated at Johns Hopkins and Cambridge. For many years, he worked in publishing and television at such companies as Time Inc., Macmillan, the Health Network, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. In the last decade, he has helped lead capital campaigns at the Portsmouth Abbey School, the Intrepid Fallen Heroes Fund, the Archdiocese of New York, and the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola. Away from work, James MacGuire chairs the Man of War Project, serves on the development committee of the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, and is a longtime member of the International Lawn Tennis Association Club. MacGuire's writing has appeared in many national publications, and he is the author or co-author of 10 books and 2 beloved sons, Pierce and Rhodes. Please welcome James MacGuire.
Thank you very much, Penny. I couldn't have written that better myself. Thanks, and what a pleasure to be with you all here at the library to speak about my book, Real Lace Revisited, Inside the Hidden World of America's Irish Aristocracy. People ask why I chose this topic. After all, isn't the very phrase, Irish aristocracy, oxymoronic? The truth is, my publisher, Jed Lyons, was strangely impervious to the charm of my earlier book proposals, Great Moments in Curling, Codependent Forever. If only I had the inspiration, I should have added Billiards at the Union Club, 1836-2007. But one of that club's members got there first, has undoubtedly reaped the riches therefrom. At any rate, in early 2015, Jed sighed and suggested, why not ritzy people and swanky places? I immediately complimented him on his prodigious genius and contacted Stephen Birmingham, whom I had met in Mary Lou Whitney's box at the Saratoga races 25 years ago. Birmingham was the author of Our Crowd, the bestseller on the early German Jewish fortunes, who then in 1973 took up the Irish in the original Real Lace. When I approached him, Steve, then in his mid-80s and retired, was amenable to having the book updated and expanded, and even offered to write a foreword. And then, sadly, he died. So I never got the foreword, but instead got a free hand to write the book as I wanted. The result is that Real Lace Revisited is comprised of more than 95% original material. It's most certainly not an intellectual history. I've written a couple of those, and I have the royalty checks to prove it. No, this book is more of a social history and entertainment. It's meant to be a colorful portrait of the Irish-American experience in business, politics, sport, philanthropy, and religion. The book begins with the real first Irish family, the Carrolls of Maryland, whose patriarch, Charles Carroll the Settler, emigrated from Ireland in the 1680s and achieved such wealth and political prominence that in the third generation, his grandson, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, became the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. His descendants are still active in society and the church today, including one, Casey Carter, who is the CEO of Faith in the Future Foundation, which is making remarkable strides in rejuvenating the Catholic high schools in Greater Philadelphia. Another, Southampton's own Carol Moulton, is a distinguished scholar and textbook editor, and he hoped to be here tonight, but I don't see him at the moment. The book then traces the swelling tides of emigration from Ireland to America. Initially, it primarily Ulster Protestants to the south, where even as late as the 1840s, there was an entire county in Mississippi where Irish was the lingua franca. An early governor of the pre-statehood Republic of Texas was none other than Hugo O'Connor, whose family had been among the so-called wild geese who made their way out of Ireland to serve in the Spanish army after the Williamite Wars. But of course, the greatest outflow was of starving, land-deprived Catholics after the Great Famine in the 1840s. The newly arrived Irish encountered considerable prejudice with no Irish need apply signs and criticisms of their ignorance and superstition. A typical story was that of the Irishman chopping wood in a New Jersey forest who became frightened of fairies in the forest. It was his first experience of fireflies. Anti-Irish sentiment among nativists and know-nothings brought simmering tensions and occasional violence, as the Martin Scorsese film, The Gangs of New York, depicted so graphically, including the draft riots of the Civil War era. In preparing my remarks for a talk at the Union Club last fall, its past president, Van Berger, kindly made available to me John Steele Gordon's excellent 2012 history of that club. And there I was delighted to find on page 72 a description of the incident on Thanksgiving Day 1920, when at the third clubhouse at 1 East 51st Street, the club was flying, in addition to the stars and stripes, the flags of our country's recent wartime allies, France and Britain. As it happened, the Irish Free State was then struggling to be born, and the Lord Mayor of Cork had recently starved himself to death in a British jail to promote that process. A memorial service for the deceased beginning at St. Patrick's Cathedral next door, the club's senior neighbor at that location for over half a century, resulted in the outraged crowd demanding that the Union Jack be lowered as a sign of respect. The club manager did so, but after the mourners went into the cathedral, J. Frederick Tams, the vice president and senior officer president, ordered it set out again. He said the Union Club would not be dictated to by a mob. When the mourners came out of the cathedral after the Mass and saw the flag, they stormed the club, intent on taking it down themselves. Several members held them off at the front stairs until the police could arrive. Rocks were then thrown through the plate glass windows, which rocks were returned by the members. Finally, mounted police galloped down from Central Park and were able to restore order. A joke soon made its way around the city to the effect that the Union Club is very convenient, only a stone's throw from St. Patrick's. From this remove and the press that followed, it sounds as if everyone on both sides had a very good time. Mr. Henry E. Montgomery of Jones, Montgomery, and Auchincloss did so, and added, "My only regret is that I was not there in person to assist in keeping out the damn Irish mob. It's about time that something was done to try to keep the Irish from trying to run this country, as they have certainly done the city of New York for a long time." When I spoke at the Union Club last fall, Mr. Ambler assured us that when he had been a member of the University Club, he and fellow club members had to help the doorman blockade its doors one year against St. Patrick's Day parade revelers seeking the comfort facilities. That put me in mind of the peer who was in the habit of stopping off for a similar purpose at the Athenaeum as he walked home each night from the House of Lords. One evening, a footman declined to admit him as instructed because the honorable gentleman was not a member. The incredulous response came back, "You mean to tell me this place is a club as well?" Even as late as 1928, the Ku Klux Klan worked actively to defeat the first Catholic candidate for president, New York Governor Alfred E. Smith. For as the Irish developed their mastery of the political process, in part aided, ironically, by their fluency in the English the British occupiers had forced them to adopt, they took their place in the urban power structure, if not in establishment society, leading the late Boston College historian Thomas N. Brown to write, "They could run the cities, but couldn't get into the country clubs." The resistance to Irish and later Jewish acceptance by the mainstream Protestant establishment led University of Pennsylvania sociologist E. Digby Baltzell, himself an enlightened WASP, to posit the theory that for an upper class to maintain its continuity of power, they must be representative of the composition of society as a whole. Thus, the establishment's initial rejection of the Irish and the Jews helped sow the seeds of its own decline. Among the first Irish fortunes to be made at the dawn of the 20th century was that of serial inventor Thomas E. Murray, a partner of Thomas Edison's. Murray could claim over 400 patents by the time he died, and was CEO of the company that ran all the power plants in New York City. He kept a private chapel in his now demolished mansion on St. Mark's Avenue in Brooklyn, and in his bedroom was an elaborate alarm system, so if there was a problem in any of the plants during the night, the appropriate alarm would ring, and he could jump out of bed and hurry down to deal with it. And we have a member, a latter-day Murray here, David Murray is here. Are you a great-grandson or a great-great-grandson?
Great-grandson.
Great-grandson, sorry. I also talk about Irish fortunes nationally, such as the Doheny oil empire in Mexico and the western U.S., which inspired Upton Sinclair's oil, and the Daniel Day-Lewis film, There Will Be Blood. Turning to business, the Irish Americans have remained active in the half-century since the publication of the original Real Lace. Nicholas Brady, whose great-grandfather helped finance Thomas E. Murray, was managing partner of Dillon Reed and later Secretary of the Treasury. Nick, in addition to being an all-around rackets player and golfer, is a former chairman of the Jockey Club and still active in racing and breeding in Ireland with Coolmore today. Then there are cable TV pioneers John Malone, Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan, Don Kehoe of Coca-Cola, the Fords of the Ford Motor Company, in more recent years joined by outstanding women executives like Anne Sweeney and Christine McCarthy of Disney. The military. It may interest you to know that Irish Americans have won more medals of honor than any other ethnic group. The Fighting 69th received its name from none other than General Robert E. Lee for its furious charge up Mary's Heights at Fredericksburg and demonstrated its heroism in France again in 1917. The brigade commander, General Douglas MacArthur, seriously considered naming its chaplain, Father Francis Duffy, regimental commander, an unheard of honor for a priest. Father Duffy's statue still adorns the square named in his honor in the theater district between Broadway and 7th Avenue, where the TKTS booth is today. And the Fighting 69th still takes its place at the head of the line of march, leading the parade up 5th Avenue every March 17th. But there has been a slight change. In the Civil War, the 69th was 90% Irish. In World War I, it was 50% Irish. Today, it is indeed a rainbow division, no more than 20% Irish. But every member of the unit is designated an honorary Irishman who, in Father Duffy's words, are Irish by adoption, Irish by association, or Irish by conviction. God bless America. I touch on sport at some length in the book, such as the Irish-American domination of early baseball in the 1880s and 1890s. Even in our time, there have been colorful players like Tug McGraw, who when asked how we would spend his then stratospheric salary of $70,000 in 1975 answered, "I'll spend 90% of it on good times, women, and Irish whiskey. The other 10% I'll probably waste." Irish Americans were also, of course, prominent in horse racing. Today, the Rooney and Mara families, both of whom started as horse racing entrepreneurs, aka bookies, remain influential in the success of the National Football League. I also talk about the social side of the Irish in spots like Saratoga, where at the old Piping Rock Casino, a cousin of my father's generation once threw her mink coat down in the roulette wheel at 4 in the morning and cried out, "Put that on black." I'll tell one more Saratoga story. Walter and Kay Jeffords lived next door to the Phipps on North Broadway. Jeff's grandfather was Samuel D. Riddle, the breeder-owner of Man of War, the mostest horse who ever was. Kay's father was the powerful Brooklyn banker George D. McLaughlin, who at one time controlled the Dodgers in a bankruptcy before Walter O'Malley bought the team and broke Brooklyn's heart by moving the Dodgers to L.A. Anyway, one night our friend Sally Jeffords had a very festive dinner party at the house with gallons of champagne. Towards midnight, the butler next door reported to Ogden Phipps that there appeared to be young ladies and gentlemen skinny dipping in the pool. "Shall I call the police, sir?" he asked. "No," came the answer. "Hand me my binoculars first." Politics. In terms of politics, the original Real Lace mentioned the Kennedys only to exclude them because of their Arabist bad manners and ethics. Half a century on, however, whatever their human failings, the Kennedys' long tradition of public service deserves commendation. Teddy Kennedy was the second most senior member of the Senate when he died, and was the fourth longest-serving senator in U.S. history, shepherding more than 300 bills into law. For all of his faults, he was a giant of public service, which decades before he had proclaimed his true vocation. The New York Times obituarist wrote, "He was a Rabelaisian figure in the Senate and in life, instantly recognizable by his shock of white hair, his florid, oversized face, his booming Boston brogue, his powerful but pained stride. He was a celebrity, sometimes a self-parody, an implacable foe, a man of large faith and large flaws, a melancholy character who persevered, drank deeply, and sang loudly. He was a Kennedy." The latest examples of Kennedy public service are Caroline's successfully completed ambassadorship to Japan under President Obama, and young Joe Kennedy's earnest response to this year's State of the Union address. It will be interesting to see what they do next. I contrast the Kennedys with the Buckleys, the conservative political family. After his death in 2008, the first conference on Bill Buckley was held at Portsmouth Abbey outside of Newport, Rhode Island. The Catholic William F. Buckley Jr. focused on a crucial aspect of Buckley's life and thought, which had been underreported in the mainstream media. Former presidential speechwriter and Episcopalian Clark Judge called Buckley's greatest creative act the introduction of a Catholic sensibility into the main currents of American political thought. Quoting, "He showed the acuity of his technical understanding of finance in The Unmaking of a Mayor. The appendix collects the position papers he wrote for his candidacy, including one on New York's fiscal situation. In 1975, when New York almost went bankrupt, politicians and journalists alike, including, for example, the much celebrated Ken Auletta, chronicler of the near bankruptcy, insisted that no one could have predicted the crisis. They conveniently forgot, if they had ever bothered to know, that Bill Buckley had diagnosed its causes and forecast its coming a decade earlier." Clark Judge concluded his remarks, "Through the application of Catholic moral sensibility and Catholic styles of discourse, his teaching clarified during pivotal decades the political thought of the United States, and I believe will continue to clarify that thought for as long as there is a United States." As many of you remember, Bill's wit and verbal dexterity were legendary. When asked what he would do if he won the election in his 1965 insurgent mayoral bid, he replied, "Demand a recount." Several years later, after his brother had won an upset victory to the Senate from New York, William F. Buckley was again asked if he might consider running for office again. "Yes," he replied, "so long as this time around, voting is by invitation only." Bill's older brother, James Lane Buckley, the only person in modern times to hold senior positions in all three branches of the federal government, Senator, Undersecretary of State, and a judge on the Court of Appeals for Washington, D.C., is still going strong at 95 years young this year. There is a memorable exchange between Jim and Daniel Patrick Moynihan when they ran against each other for the U.S. Senate in New York. Buckley opened the debate by courteously addressing Pat as Professor Moynihan, to which Moynihan responded, "Aha, let the mudslinging begin." And I should mention a relatively rare instance of rapprochement between the Buckleys and the Kennedys. One winter at Stade, Teddy Kennedy appeared at the Eagles Club on the mountain, that lunchtime sanctuary of such worthies as Jane Delamo, David Niven, Roger Moore, Hockey, Ken Galbraith, and Bill Buckley. It proved to be so congenial a meeting that Ted was invited to the Buckley Chateau for dinner that night, which also proved a merry occasion. When it became clear that Teddy shared Bill's enthusiasm for painting, they decided to the studio after dinner with postprandials to practice their art. Upon returning, the rest of the party had left, and Teddy asked if he might borrow a car to return to his hotel. At that point, Patricia Taylor Buckley drew herself up into her most imperious Anglo-Canadian glare and said, "Are you serious? Don't you know there are no fewer than 4 bridges between here and there?" Before leaving politics, I would be remiss not to mention a quip that the Honorable Leverett Saltonstall made one St. Patrick's Day, when the ink-stained wretches of the Fourth Estate asked the Herb Rahman senator if he had any Irish blood in him. I think so," he replied slowly, "on my chauffeur's side." Philanthropy. Irish Americans remain extremely philanthropic, especially towards church-related causes, even in an age of ever-increasing secularization. The MacArthur Foundation, famous for its Genius Awards, Chuck Feeney of Duty Free Shoppers and Atlantic Philanthropies, Tom Monahan of Domino's Pizza and Ave Maria University, Peter Flanagan of Student Sponsored Partners and the Inner City Scholarship Fund, and Tom Murphy of Cap Cities ABC, as well as a younger generation, including Sean Filer and Brian Kelly of Activision, are just a few examples. I also, of course, mentioned the long-time Irish prominence in the arts, including Eugene O'Neill, Maureen O'Sullivan, Maureen O'Hara, someone's neighbor in the Caribbean here, right? Gene Kelly, John Wayne, Bing Crosby, Grace Kelly, carried forward in this generation by poet Billy Collins and television talents like Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, Conan O'Brien, Jim and Jeannie Gaffigan, novelist Alice McDermott, Jay McInerney, a Southamptonite, and Jennifer Egan, musical actress Kelly O'Hara, and many others, including Irish-American humorist P.J. O'Rourke, who at a dinner during the 1996 election campaign prophetically remarked, as President Clinton was mopping up the floor with Bob Dole, "Clinton's doing so well in the polls, he's considering dating again." Now, this year, is the 80th anniversary of the hurricane of 1938. And I think it's worth mentioning, for those of you who may have read it or may not have, an iconic Southampton novel written by David's uncle, Jake Murray, called The Devil Walks on Water. It was written in 1968, but set during the Great Hurricane. Jake Murray was a grandson of Thomas E. Murray and an advertising executive and author. The protagonist, Bryony Mitchell, is the devilish anti-hero of The Devil Walks on Water. Bryony is a graduate of the Priory, as Portsmouth Abbey School was then known, who is now an insolent, indolent, but not entirely ignorant summer vacationer from Princeton, which he loves, though his uncle Aidan Carew, citing canon law, would prefer he go to Georgetown. Bryony is the Peck's bad boy at the East End, removing his polo shirt as he watches Midge, the object of his lust, play tennis at the Meadow Club. Other Hamptons locales used as settings in the novel include the Devon Yacht Club, countless shops, and a colorful pre-war house of assignation referred to here as Aunt Margaret's, where Bryony frequently shacks up with the frustrated wife of a local town cop. Anyway, Bryony is a handsome and hairy-chested bad actor who delights in tweaking convention. He discusses sexual mechanics at great length in a way that may have seemed racy when written before how-to books on the subject began outselling the Bible. He's an angry black sheep in search of himself who delights in his alter ego as the Phantom, speeding by police cars in his sports car and then hiding from them on unpaved tracks deep in the sand dunes. On the final night of the novel, as the hurricane descends, Bryony helps start a brawl during a dance at Devon between the Andovers and the more recently cooped-up Irish-American contingent. Later he gets set upon by the natives, aka year-round working-class residents at Aunt Margaret's, when he brings Midge there, but his compliant cop's wife girlfriend is waiting for him in an upstairs bedroom. Though badly beaten, he somehow escapes back to the house where the night began and seduces a newly Irish maid. Then, in the climactic scene, as the hurricane crashes inland, Bryony tries to leave the maid's room by her window to walk down the roof line, but is unintentionally knocked off it when his little sister opens her shutters. Rather than die in a 30-foot fall, however, because the storm has burst the dunes and flooded the back of the town, Bryony is swept away. He finally gets to his car and drives to Midge's house, the wreck, which has been destroyed, and Midge's room above the porte cochere swept out onto Acapulco Pond. Bryony swims there and climbs onto the remains of the roof. He knocks and hears Midge knock back faintly, trapped but still alive in an air bubble below. Bryony saws and hacks through the roof and with his bare hands extricates Midge and swims her to safety, all the while imagining them coupling lustfully. Once out of danger, he is utterly exhausted and also realizes the last vestiges of his tuxedo have been shredded. Our quasi-Celtic mythological hero stands before all the wreckage of the world, starkers. But unlike Adam and Eve, expelled from the garden, Bryony Mitchell is utterly unashamed. It's quite a tale of days long gone by, and much of it based on fact. The real Irish Americans were considered upstarts by the older established Ross families in Southampton. The Murrays and McDonalds both lost houses in their oceanfront compound during the hurricane of '38. It wasn't Aunt Margaret's, fondly remembered by the older generation. The clubs are much the same as they were then, and friction still breaks to the surface like a painful hernia between the summer folk and the year-rounders. I'll go on to close and to say stereotypes often have an ounce or more of truth to them, and the Irish are no exception. Here are three. The great Gaels of Ireland, the men that God made men, for all their wars are merry, and all their songs are sad. Or the Irish, they never learn, but they never forget. And finally, President Reagan's definition of Irish Alzheimer's, which turned out to be quite poignant. You forget everything, except the grudges. But to be serious for a moment, we're now in the 102nd anniversary year of the 1916 Easter Rising. Yes, the newly declared Irish Republic lasted only 6 days before it was brutally put down and its leaders executed. But for Countess Markowitz and Eamon de Valera, who were pardoned and lived to fight another day as worldwide public opinion began to turn against British imperialism. With the benefit of hindsight, today we understand that Easter 1916 was the dawn of the coming Irish Free State. None of that could have come to pass without the Irish in New York and America generally, rich and poor, who had experienced freedom, constitutional government, and religious liberty on these shores that had been denied them at home. They had fought successfully for their civil and religious liberties here in the U.S. and were committed to doing the same for those who remained in their native country. I would go farther and say that the Irish experience leading to the declaration of the Free State in 1923 also informed later anti-colonial independence movements in India and Africa, and may have helped inspire aspects of our own struggles for African American civil rights in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which, in another of history's ironic terms, led to the song "We Shall Overcome" becoming an anthem of Catholics fighting discrimination and injustice in Northern Ireland on Bloody Sunday and in the Troubles, starting in the 1970s. The American and Irish experiences are thus ever intertwined. Let's never forget that, and that ultimately there are many ways of being Irish in America, and all of them should be celebrated for what they are. I'll close with the famous lines of W.B. Yeats' great poem, "Eat Wishes for the Cloths of Heaven," often interpreted as a love poem, but which for me is a song of yearning for the kind of completion we all, Irish and American, seek and strive for in the course of our earthly journey. And are the heavens embroidered cloths, and wrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread the cloths under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, I'll go first. I would just say this, that my uncle, were he here, would be so delighted that you spoke of his book, which I was young when it was published, but it got a lot of attention. And actually, it had been a coup for my uncle because he had had hard times and then would go through them again. The only thing I would say, and this is in no way to diminish what you said about the book, because it was a romp and fun, but my Uncle Jake published 2 stories in the New Yorker in the mid-'70s. One was called Ophelin's Demonium. And another was also Ophelin's. I think they appeared in 1976 and 1977.
Yeah.
And they are wonderful, deeply moving, sad, but beautifully written stories. The final thing I'd say is that my father, who was Jake's brother, who also came upon difficult times at the end of his life. When Jake disappeared in the winter of 1977, my father, I was living with my father at the time, and he used to get phone calls from the war because he had notified the police that his brother had not been seen since he had left the offices of the New Yorker in January 1977. And in fact, Roger Angel's memoir, I can't remember the name of it, but there's a chapter on my Uncle Jake in the book in which he refers to it, that Jake had come to the New Yorker and wanted to crash there because he had no place to go. At any rate, the last time my father saw him, he was wearing kind of a Holden Caulfield hunting jacket, checked with white and black. And when he was found 4 months later, 3 months later, in April 1977, he had washed up, I believe, in Staten Island.
You washed up on Staten Island.
And he had been in the water so long that his features had been dissolved. But at any rate, the funeral that was held for my uncle was really wonderful, and his life, at the risk of telling things that I'm not really certain about, was ennobled, I think, in many ways by the work that he left behind.
Well, if I could go on from that, I shortened what I was going to say a little bit, but David is a psychotherapist, and if you read Ophelin's Demonium or Ophelin's Drinking, which is the name of the other story, their clarity and wealth of detail read almost like a medical textbook of mania, progressive alcoholism, and the descent into schizophrenia. And that is not an unusual story amongst the Irish, and certainly in my family as well, and many others, so it makes it all the more heartbreaking. And your aunt, Pat Murray Wood-Nay, when I spoke to her as I was doing the research on this, told me that the story of him going in to ask for a meeting with Roger Angel and then disappearing, and that was the last time he was ever seen. So thank you very much for saying that.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Well, could you talk a little bit about your own Irish roots?
My great-grandfather, as I mentioned in the book, was named James Butler. All the others were already here. He came over around 1876 and worked his way up in the hotel trade, and then became a co-owner of one grocery store in New York City. He bought out his partner and ended up with what became the second largest chain of grocery stores to A&P, and then decided that he would diversify into the horse racing business. And ultimately, he owned what is today Empire City Casino, and
So that's your grandfather?
Yeah, great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather.
Yeah, and also had a Laurel racetrack, and at one point, with Colonel Matt Wynn, who was the father of the Kentucky Derby, when the reformers ended horse racing for 3 years in the teens, they went down to Juarez, just across from El Paso, and started racing there. Their third partner was what's the name of the inventor of the hot dog? Harry, I'll think of it in a moment. Harry Stevens.
Oh, Stevens.
And then they got a fourth partner who they weren't expecting, and that was Pancho Villa, who rode across the countryside with his cavalry and insisted upon inserting his band as the official racetrack band. I think they had to buy them all tunics with brass buttons.
Are you are you in touch with people in Ireland who?
Yeah, actually, very fortunately, my great-grandfather's wife died in 1902, and he sent his kids back to Ireland every summer to be with his widows, his people, and that connection stayed. So when I actually went to graduate school and decided to do my research on the Anglo-Irish playwright John Millington Synge, who wrote Riders to the Sea, Playboy of the Western World, and played a great role along with Lady Gregory and Yates in starting the Abbey Theatre. His papers were all at Trinity College Dublin, so I would go over there and stay with my fourth and fifth cousins, and it was a wonderful experience, and so we're all still in touch today.
That's great.
Yes?
Your comment about is the term Irish aristocracy an oxymoron? Can you comment on that?
Yes, I think it's a ridiculous phrase, to be honest, but Birmingham thought he was going to sell books by using it, and his phrase was first Irish families, and he claimed that it was a phrase. David has another relative who was also an aunt of mine and married my uncle Jim MacGuire, named Mary Jane Cuddy, and she was a great source for him talking about that sort of stuff. But nobody I know of any of these families would ever have they would have been appalled at the idea of referring to themselves like that, and didn't. So
I think that's true, and one thing I would say is that my mother's family was scandalized when she was going to marry my father, because he was Irish Catholic.
right.
And my father's family was scandalized that he was going to marry a Protestant. So at the time,
They'd love grandparents.
and my mother was something of a, I think she told a tall tale. She tells the time of visiting in Southampton and having people turn their back on her from my father's family.
Yeah, I'm sure that was true. And if I could give a plug, David's brother, Tommy Murray, is the producer and director of a magnificently moving documentary called Nixon's in Heaven, Dad's in Heaven with Nixon, which is mostly about his autistic brother and his perseverance to make a way for himself in the world. And it turns out, despite his disability, he's got just a tremendous gift for art and has become a successful artist. And it's a beautiful movie, which
We showed it here at the library, actually.
You should do it again.
It was wonderful. I
Yeah.
loved it.
Hi. Yeah. Yes.
My grandfather is fairly well known as an architect here in Southampton, New York, etc. And my mother was a Catholic, and I remember years ago I had a very good friend named Wainwright.
Right.
And she went to Chapin, I went to Sacred Heart, and we palled around a lot. And she said, you know, I feel really bad that you've had me over to your house, you know, X amount of times, and I've never had you back. My mother will not have a Catholic in the house.
Well, I'll tell another story. Like when Governor Howard Dean married a fellow doctor who happened to be Jewish, his mother said, well, there goes Maidstone. And when Walker and Alice Wainwright's daughter, Nina, got married, she was married by a rabbi at the Maidstone Club. So life does change. It takes a long time, but hopefully we go forward. Yes?
You know, I was thinking, you were mentioning some of these names or dismal state of politics in this country. Looking back at some of the Irish names that you mentioned, I remember laughing as a 12-year-old boy. I just loved President Kennedy's press conferences. It was so funny sometimes. I mean, he had a real great sense of humor. President Reagan had a great sense of humor. Pat Moynihan, Bill Buckley.
Yeah.
I remember having my Bill Buckley buttoned in high school.
Right.
And my father telling me, well, if he gets a lot of votes, we'll wind up with Lindsay.
But that was accurate.
But I mean, they were men who could really, I mean, there's no color today compared to them.
Tip O'Neill,
Yeah.
even Hugh Carey, Mike Mansfield.
Well, you carry, that's stretching it.
I'll grant you that. They're on Shelter Island, it doesn't count as a habit. People sometimes ask me what I learned writing the book, and really what my publisher and I thought was of potential interest was to kind of, Birmingham had just used the same formula. He took families that had done well at the end of the 1800s and in the early 20th century, but I thought let's, in New York, but let's nationalize this. So in the book there are stories about the South, about the Midwest, about the Far West, and also bring things up to date. So we see a lot of sadness, a lot of failure along the way, but also a lot of resilience. And I think, again, that's something that's a universal of the American experience. Like you, I hope for a day where civility, decency, and humor will once again animate our public square.
Jamie, I was interested in your book about how much detail you had concerning Murray McDonnell and the fall of McDonnell Company. How did you research that?
Well, Michael McDonnell and I were classmates, along with your cousin and Michael's cousin, Kevin Sullivan, at Portsmouth, and I was in Michael's wedding. And Murray McDonnell and I became very good friends, although Mike went out west to go into the movie business, as you know, and now is running a construction business in Santa Monica, or Malibu. But Murray and I remained very friendly, had lunch often, and I was at his funeral, and quite a bit of that chapter is verbatim things that were said, or that I already knew about. But, this is Murray McDonnell, whose mother was a Murray, was on top of the world and then had to suffer the humiliation and defeat of seeing his family stockbrokerage company go bankrupt, and earned the enmity of many of his family who were stockholders in the company, and had to decide how he was going to respond. And F. Scott Fitzgerald said there are no second acts in American lives, but I think Murray's life is an example of a transcendent second act.
Was the family at all chary about speaking to you? Because Anna is a friend of mine, and it's a subject that she's been unable to talk to me about.
She was called Puddin when she was a little girl, and I was older. Now Anna, yeah, I would say they were at best neutral, but I had all the material already, and what were they going to do? And I hope that what comes across is a very loving portrait of the family and the man that I felt very close to.
Excuse me, I just want to ask you one more thing. Do you believe the family mythology that Sean's death was central in the loss of the company a couple years later?
So David's referring to Murray McDonnell's 29-year-old brother, who was the CFO of McDonnell and Company, who one day went out jogging in Greenwich and died of a massive heart attack. And it was just at the time that Wall Street was, the old system of having runners coming from the floor to the various houses was giving way to computerization. And Murray was essentially a salesman who liked nothing better than fly out to Detroit and have lunch with Henry Ford, his brother-in-law, and opened offices in Paris and elsewhere. But maybe the nuts and bolts of back office were not what he really wanted to be concentrating on. So I don't know, I never knew Sean. That's the story as it's always been told. Murray went on to have good clients, working at Allen & Company, but there are other firms. Hayden Stone failed in that era, and others did as well. It was a time of tremendous technological change on Wall Street, which has continued until this day.
What year was that?
1970, spring of 1970. Murray asked Aristotle Onassis if he would be helpful in bailing them out, and the answer came back. There was no answer that came back. Yeah.
Were there any notable people that you had to leave out?
Oh, God, I mean, I really feel that you could go on for thousands of pages. So many wonderful politicians, humorists, Finley Peter Dunn, and I could have gone on the arts forever. It was an interesting one. So yeah, it's just a sampling, really, just an entertainment, and I've been in giving talks like this, I've been called on the carpet for not having mentioned any number of people. And all I can say is I apologize. Great, well, I'd be happy to sign books for anyone who might want one, but otherwise, thank you so much for coming.
I want to second that. Thank you. That was delightful, and speaking of entertaining, very entertaining. I want to mention that on August 15th, we have a speaker coming to talk about the Irish in America as well. It won't be as entertaining as this, I'm sure, but it'll be slightly different, but it'll be about the immigrant's journey and what happened when they arrived. On October 10th, we have a woman coming in to talk about dual citizenship. So, for those of you who may be interested in getting an Irish passport, or an EU passport, Irish or Italian, those are her areas of specialty. So, do come back in October for that if you like. Meanwhile, this was a wonderful evening, Jimmy. Thank you so much.